She didn't stop loving you because you were too quiet. She stopped feeling you because you were too available. You kept showing up, not just in presence, but in constant reassurance, constant explanation, constant permission seeking. And every time you did, a small piece of your weight disappeared. You didn't see it, but she did. She felt it. And slowly, the man who once moved with his own rhythm became a background hum. Comforting, predictable, ignorable. You believed consistency would earn her respect. You thought your care would be enough. You offered stability, patience, and forgiveness, as if they were currency. But somewhere between your giving and her silence, you lost something. Not her attention, your center. You stopped standing where you once stood, anchored in your own truth. You bent. You adjusted. You waited. Not because you were weak, but because you believed being needed meant being loved. And that belief cost you more than her affection. It cost you yourself. Zeno of Citium lost everything in a shipwreck. No warning, no preparation, just silence and salt water. But that wreck, that moment of loss, became his initiation. He walked the streets of Athens not with fury or desperation, but with stillness. He observed. He listened. He detached, not from the world, but from the need to be chosen by it. What he began was not coldness, it was self-possession. And you too have reached that moment. A kind of shipwreck. Maybe it wasn't sudden. Maybe it was slow, but you feel it now. The silence after trying too long. Seneca once said, "If you wish to be loved, love yourself." But not in the shallow way the world speaks of now. Not in mirror affirmations or self-help slogans. Love yourself in presence. Love yourself in boundaries. Love yourself in the silence where your need used to scream. Because generosity without edges becomes servitude. And that's what happened to your attention. You didn't offer it. You handed it over. And she stopped respecting what she never had to earn. This isn't a tactic to get her back. This isn't a trick to make her miss you. This is a quiet return to the man you were before you learned to prove yourself, before you believed emotional availability meant sacrifice, before you confused being seen with being validated. This isn't about her anymore. It's about you, the man who used to move through the world with calm certainty, the man who didn't rush to respond, the man who could sit in silence, not to punish, but because he had nothing to defend. She didn't break you. You forgot your weight. And now you remember. Not with noise, not with blame, but with the same calm Zeno carried through Athens. Still, present, unapologetic, not detached from love, just no longer enslaved by it. Now, we begin. It never begins with an explosion. It starts with silence and subtle rewrites of how she looks at you. Her responses come slower. Her eyes stay longer on her phone than on yours. She cuts your sentence halfway through and doesn't notice. You tell yourself it's nothing. You brush it off, but your body feels it. Your gut tightens. Your tone changes. You start to ask, is everything okay? Not because something obvious happened, but because something inside her pulled back. And part of you knows she's watching. Not your words, not your effort, but your spine. What she's doing, often without knowing, is testing your core. She's not consciously manipulating, she's instinctively scanning. She wants to know if the man sitting across from her still has a center that won't shake just because she turns away. And most men? They respond by leaning in. More texts, more compliments, more patience, more proving. But the Stoic man doesn't chase the drift. He doesn't fill the silence. He doesn't negotiate his worth. He pauses. He re-anchors. Because he knows, if someone needs to test your value, they already doubt it. There's a brutal honesty in this. When your presence becomes too predictable, too compliant, too available, it loses polarity. It no longer moves her. It no longer grounds the room. And it's not because kindness is weak. It's because kindness without edge becomes emotional background noise. You were supposed to be the storm she trusted, not the breeze she controlled. The difference is felt in how you carry your silence. Reward systems don't lie. What is freely offered without context gets subconsciously devalued. The same way attention without restraint becomes invisible. You didn't mean to give yourself away. You thought you were showing care, but what you were actually doing was bleeding presence, slowly, silently, until one day she stopped feeling you, not because you vanished, but because you overexposed your center. Masculine presence doesn't announce itself. It doesn't chase tests. It doesn't collapse under distance. It stays, rooted, grounded, not as punishment, but as proof. When she pulls away, don't panic. Don't perform, just pause. That pause, that's the beginning of being felt again. Not as a man begging for connection, but as a man who never left himself. Every time you explain yourself too much, a part of you disappears, not because words are wrong, but because you're not speaking to be understood. You're speaking to avoid rejection, to keep peace, to keep her. And in that pattern, something sacred gets traded. Your presence becomes a performance. Your self-respect becomes negotiation. And the man she once looked at with gravity becomes a man asking for permission to exist. You don't notice it at first. You think you're just clarifying, being open, making sure she feels safe. But what you're really doing, beneath the surface, is asking, is this enough? Am I enough? And the more you ask it, the more she feels the question. And the more she feels the question, the less she sees the man. Not because she's cruel, but because the masculine stops being magnetic when it starts asking to be seen. There's a paradox here. Emotionally, people respond not to predictability, but to contrast, to polarity. When your behavior becomes too consistent without edge, without silence, without stance, it fades into white noise. And that's what you became. Not because you were weak, but because you thought being available was the same as being worthy. You thought her comfort mattered more than your ground. Approval seeking is not love. It's survival in disguise. It's fear painted as devotion. It's a man losing his edge by mistaking validation for connection. And every time you check in too much, every time you apologize for things you didn't do, every time you soften your truth just to keep things smooth, you lower your presence in her emotional field, not by accident, but by habit. But here's the shift. The man who doesn't need to be validated is not cold. He's anchored. He doesn't force his truth. He stands in it, quietly, calmly, consistently, and that kind of presence is rare. That kind of presence is remembered. Sometimes it's the man who doesn't call, who's remembered most. Not because he ghosted, but because his absence carried weight. She felt him when he left because he wasn't trying to be felt while he stayed. He was just real, rooted, not reactive. And in a world that rewards noise, stillness is power. It didn't happen during the fight. It didn't happen when she raised her voice or when she started pulling away. It happened in a quiet, forgettable moment when you chose peace over presence, when you swallowed your truth just to avoid distance, when you gave in, not because you were wrong, but because you didn't want to lose her. That's when it happened, not with an explosion, but with a quiet surrender. Respect doesn't disappear in one blow. It erodes, slowly, in small moments where you silence yourself, explain too much, soften your boundaries just to keep the connection alive. She watched you trade your edge for acceptance. She felt the shift, not because you were unkind, but because you stopped being undeniable. You wanted to be safe. She wanted to feel your fire. And when that fire dimmed under the weight of emotional compromise, she didn't yell. She just stopped looking at you the same way. You thought love meant sacrifice, but what she needed wasn't your submission. It was your spine. She wanted to feel where you end and where she begins. She wanted to bump into your boundary and feel something solid. But you kept offering softness. You kept apologizing for your strength. And so she stopped testing your edge because she stopped believing it was there. Zeno didn't shout when he lost everything. He didn't try to explain his worth. He walked quietly, deliberately, through the streets of Athens, carrying only one thing, his presence. Because dignity isn't spoken, it's felt. And the man who knows his weight never begs to be heard. You don't need to prove you're worthy of respect. You just need to stop negotiating with people who forgot it. Let your silence carry what your words never could. Let your withdrawal speak louder than any plea. Because when you finally stop explaining yourself, that's when you become unforgettable again. Not out of revenge, but out of reverence. For the man you used to be before you asked for permission to be him. You told yourself you were just showing her your heart, that you were fighting for the relationship, that love takes effort, and you were willing to do the work. But deep down, you knew it wasn't effort, it was exhaustion, a quiet, constant depletion of your energy, your confidence, your dignity, all in the name of proving you were enough for someone who stopped looking. You start with words, then actions, then gifts, then silence. You try being loud, then quiet, then soft, then strong. You shift and adjust and mold yourself into everything you think she needs, until one day you don't recognize the man in the mirror. That's not love, that's self-erasure with good intentions. That's a man pouring himself into a well that no longer reflects his presence. And the deeper tragedy? You believed this was strength. You told yourself that staying meant loyalty, that holding on meant maturity, that showing her your effort would bring her back. But the truth is, what you were doing wasn't strength, it was compensation. Compensation for the fact that you stopped feeling her warmth and started trying to earn it. Love isn't earned by proving, it's remembered by presence. Stoicism isn't coldness, it's containment. It's knowing when your emotions have turned into a performance. It's recognizing when your fight is no longer about connection, it's about being seen. And that's the moment you must stop, not to punish her, but to return to yourself. Your brain under stress, under repeated rejection, begins to shut down the very part of you that creates clarity. The prefrontal cortex, your compass, goes dark, and in its place rises impulse, reaction, desperation. That's not weakness, that's neurobiology. But knowing that doesn't fix it. What fixes it is stopping, not waiting for her to notice, not hoping she'll see how much you care, but choosing, quietly and clearly, to pull your energy back. Self-respect doesn't raise its voice. It chooses its exit, not in rage, not in grief, but in peace. The peace of a man who finally sees that no amount of giving will make someone feel what they've stopped valuing. You don't prove your worth, you live it. And if she can't feel that, then maybe your silence is the only language left that still has weight. There comes a point when words become useless, not because you don't know what to say, but because you've said enough, explained enough, tried enough, and every new sentence feels like another way of proving something that should have been felt without asking. That's when silence becomes power. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of clarity, the silence of a man who no longer needs to be understood to feel whole. Detachment isn't absence, it's presence without persuasion. It's showing up without the need to be chosen. It's giving space, not to punish, but to preserve your sanity. The masculine man knows this, that sometimes stillness is louder than speaking, that sometimes walking away without anger is more powerful than standing and demanding to be seen, not because he doesn't care, but because he finally does, about himself. Epictetus said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish. Let her think you're distant. Let her assume you don't care. Let her misunderstand your silence, because the moment you try to correct her perception, you've already surrendered your ground. You've made her opinion more important than your peace, and peace, for a man who's been through the fire, is sacred. The more you chase the image of being the good man, the more you become a shadow of yourself. The more you clarify, explain, defend, the more invisible your truth becomes. Let her sit with the silence. Let her wonder. Let the absence do what presence no longer can. There's a man, maybe you know him, who walked away without slamming the door. He didn't leave in rage. He didn't disappear to make her suffer. He left because something in him grew tired of being reduced. He didn't want revenge. He wanted dignity, and that dignity couldn't survive another conversation where he had to prove his heart. That's the power of silent detachment. Not coldness, not punishment, but sacred restraint. The choice to let go, not because you stopped feeling, but because you finally remembered how much it was costing you to keep proving it. There's a certain lesson she can only learn in your absence, not when you leave in anger, not when you storm out, but when you stop responding with explanations. When you stop filling the air with reasons and justifications. When you simply go quiet, not to punish, but because there's nothing left to say without sacrificing yourself in the process. Emotional psychology is clear on one thing. The human brain is wired to notice contrast. Mirror neurons fire not when something predictable continues, but when something expected stops. That's when reflection begins. That's when the echo gets loud. She doesn't hear your voice anymore. She hears the space where it used to be, and that space, that's where truth lives now. When you stop reacting, something happens. Not to her first, but to you. You reclaim the energy you used to waste trying to manage her mood, trying to win her back, trying to explain your worth. And in that stillness, your nervous system begins to breathe again. You start to feel yourself, not as a man she sees, but as a man who no longer needs to be seen to stand tall. Zeno stood in the public square of Athens, silent, not for attention, not for validation, but to become a contrast to the noise. His stillness didn't scream, it didn't plead, it became undeniable because it asked for nothing. That's the kind of presence your absence creates. Not absence as retreat, absence as mirror, absence as boundary, absence as a quiet wall no one can walk through without feeling their own reflection hit back. Sometimes the greatest impact you'll ever have on someone is what they feel after you've stopped speaking, after your name stops lighting up their phone, after your energy stops cushioning their confusion. It's in that emptiness that realization grows. You didn't need to raise your voice. You just needed to remove your presence, long enough for its value to be remembered, long enough for the silence to speak the truth your words never could. It doesn't happen in defiance. It doesn't come with a declaration. It happens quietly, like waking up and realizing you no longer feel the need to be chosen. That moment doesn't make you cold. It makes you clear. You stop asking what she's thinking. You stop replaying conversations. You stop waiting for a message that once dictated your mood, not because you're over it, but because something in you has finally returned. When you stop caring from the need to be validated, something paradoxical happens. You become felt again, not through force, not through effort, but through gravity. Because presence without need is presence that lingers, and she starts to notice, not because you reached out, but because you didn't. Not because you explained, but because you withdrew with dignity. She notices your absence not as punishment, but as weight, the kind of weight only stillness carries. This is the paradox of Stoic masculinity. The less you try to be seen, the more she sees you. The less you chase, the more she remembers. And not because you manipulated anything, but because you finally stepped out of the performance. You stopped broadcasting your worth. You let your silence speak for you. You became still. And in that stillness, something powerful returned. You weren't made to be consumed by someone else's confusion. You weren't made to be someone's emotional placeholder. You were made to lead yourself first, to walk with your own rhythm, your own values, your own soul. And when you stop needing to be understood, when you stop caring about being right, about being chosen, about being seen, you become undeniable, because now your care is no longer a currency. It's a choice. Chrysippus, the great Stoic, called virtue the harmony between soul and action. And that's what you return to now. Your calm withdrawal isn't a strategy. It's not a trick to get her attention. It's yourself returning, your center solidifying. And that, more than any text, more than any speech, will echo long after you've gone quiet. She'll feel it, not in the space you leave, but in the weight of who you no longer become for her. That's when you become visible again, not as the man she managed, but as the man who remembered himself. You were never too much. You just gave too much of yourself away without knowing where to stop. And when you finally do, when you stop caring, not out of bitterness, but out of deep respect for your own peace, everything changes. You don't become less loving. You become less enslaved by the need to be understood. You stop asking to be felt. You start living in a way that cannot be ignored. Zeno, after losing everything, didn't become louder. He walked through Athens in silence, listening, watching, teaching, not with words, but with presence. That's who you become now. Not the man who needs to be seen, but the man who is impossible to forget because he stands without needing to explain. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one." And you, after all the exhaustion, after all the emotional noise, are ready, not to prove anything, not to change her, but to live in a way that no longer requires her permission to feel whole. Your stillness becomes your direction, your discipline becomes your devotion, and your silence becomes the loudest thing she remembers. Picture it, a man walking away, not in rage, not in grief, but with the kind of stillness that makes a room quieter after he leaves. That's not revenge, that's not manipulation, that's presence reclaiming itself. And when you walk like that, not to hurt, but to heal, you become the kind of man who no longer needs to be heard, to be felt. Because in the end, she won't remember every word you said, but she will remember how your silence finally made her listen.